Hi everyone. As you might know, we don't get any sort of funding from any wealthy benefactors, academic institutions, governments, or political parties. Our work is funded by you, our listeners and readers on Patreon. In return, our supporters on Patreon get access to exclusive content and benefits like ad-free episodes, bonus podcast episodes, and 2 exclusive Patreon-only podcast series, Fireside Chats and Radical Reads. So here's a little preview of our latest Patreon-only episode. You can join us, help support our work, and listen to the full episode today at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes.
As we come marching, marching in the beauty of the day, 1,000,000 darkened kitchens, 1,000 mill lofts grey are brightened by the beauty sun discloses, and the people here are singing bread and roses, bread and roses.
And I actually think like this discussion of like the things that give workers power in a particular situation, I think that was another thing that was like, it was so methodical, and I hadn't thought of it like that at the time. I just thought like, there's obviously early 2000s, people are still talking about like the death of class. We're all middle class now. The working class doesn't exist. It doesn't exist as a political force or whatever. And so I had, from my political perspective, it's like, no, you still have workers. You have workers who are, working in shops or working in, like call centers, and, maybe they're not like, in the UK, they're not working in steel factories anymore, or they're not mining, like, mining doesn't exist in the same way that it used to or whatever, but you still have people working for a wage. But then what this did was show me that that's actually still quite a kind of a flat analysis. Do you know what I mean? And I think like, just as, to highlight how often I think about this book is, I thought about it while watching Sorry to Bother You, the film, excellent film, brilliant film by Boots Riley.
So good.
Yeah, it's excellent film. Really can't praise it highly enough. But there was a bit, and basically the main character works in a call center, and and there's an element in the film where like they organize a strike. Basically, that's broadly. I don't want to give any spoilers away, but I felt like one of the underlying messages in it was like, the working class has changed, but the working class still exists, and the working class can still struggle in the way that they used to. And there was a bit of me that I was like, as much as I agree with the message, I thought the choice of the call center worker wasn't great. And obviously this is not a criticism of the film, because, the film is art. He's not writing a fucking sociological treatise, you know what I mean? So, like, he's made, like, an artistic film. So, like, this is I don't want to underline that this is, it doesn't take away from that. And you're not supposed to watch the film as a piece of sociology, basically. But that aside, if we were to watch the film as a piece of sociology, like, you can't just simply swap out one form of labor for another and be like, oh, we can just do this. Like, call center workers can do what car factory workers used to. And I think that's what forces of labor really kind of brought out for me, is that like different workers in different industries there's like a material basis for the power that they might have. And so, so she distinguishes between, and I don't think they're her categories. I think she takes them from another thinker called Eric Olin Wright. And basically she distinguishes between this thing of like associational power and structural power, and associational power being the power of, being in associations, so like the power of being in a union, for example. And then there's structural power, which then I think is divided into the idea of like this market, I think, which John's already mentioned, this marketplace bargaining power and workplace bargaining power. And, the marketplace bargaining power being, in the general labor market, how much power do you have? Like, if you were to lose your job, would you be able to find another one easily? If you lose your job, would you be able to look at, do you have like access to land or whatever that you'd be able to like grow your own food and sustain yourself or whatever? And workplace bargaining power being this power that you literally have in the workplace, like again what John said about, you know, on the assembly line, if you get one group of workers who like walk off, then the whole assembly line grinds to a halt. So workers end up having quite a lot of power, even if they don't have like a majority of them going on strike at any one particular time.
And yeah, and this is exactly the kind of key difference between the struggles, the largely successful struggles in the auto industry that Silver talks about in the different regions to the textile industry. Because she does point out in the late 19th century, textile workers in the UK were successfully able to win a lot better pay and conditions, largely on the strength of their associational power, that their unions in the north of England were so strong and had so much support in the community, that their strikes were so solid that they were able to win better pay and conditions. But in a lot of other places, they just have less workplace bargaining power, because unlike a car factory, if some people on one loom shuts down, it doesn't shut down the whole factory, it only shuts down that loom. So smaller groups of people can't cause as much disruption. So that's one of the reasons that textile workers have less of that kind of structural power. And other reasons are things like the machinery in textiles is a lot cheaper than it's a lot easier to set up a small textile plant and cheaper than to set up a small car factory. So it's much easier for competitors to start up a new company or for one company to move a plant than car factory workers. And this is kind of useful information for us thinking about organising where we work, where we are, and also just thinking about any other struggles going on in the world. I found it's a really useful framework that helped me think not just about, you know, things going on in the world, but also just about where you work yourself and where the kind of weaknesses are in your own employer, you know, where the employer's weak and where you have potential strength and that sort of thing. It's, I think, just a really helpful toolkit basically for thinking about and strategizing about that sort of thing, about organizing.
Yeah, I mean, again, that thing of like, you know, what happens if you go on strike? You know, what happens if people in your section go on strike? Like, what are the broader implications of it? Or like, if everyone in your workplace goes on strike, or if everyone in your industry goes on strike, what are the knock-on effects, and how does that kind of give you and your colleagues strength, basically? And I think there's, you know, because obviously, like, she talks about the textile industry as being the leading industry of the 19th century, then the car industry, the leading industry in the 20th century. And there's sort of like an interesting discussion about what might be a kind of a leading industry in the 21st century. I think it was a really interesting discussion. And also, I mean, as well as thinking about it in terms of where we work, or rather where you work, you know, like, you know, you, the listener, the general kind of you, how can you organize where you are? It also made me think about when you're part of kind of collective organization, where might a collective organization, you know, direct its collective efforts? Do you know what I mean? And like whether like, and you know, and that's one of the things that I think is really potentially really useful. You know, in terms of not just thinking, okay, yeah, so we have like we want to organize like a left political group, and so we're going to think about the ideas that we promote, but actually also thinking about what is the working class that has to be mobilized in order to move the broader, you know, not just that one set of workers, but actually to move the broader class itself. And, you know, and I say this as someone who, you know, I've largely worked in kind of peripheral industries, and I think about that quite a lot, you know. So like, even where we've organized something, ultimately within the broader class, it doesn't move very much at all.
You do say that, although one of the industries that Silver identifies as a possible, as if not the major central industry of the 21st century, possibly one of them that has more significance, is education. Because the labour market now does require a high level of education generally. And again, I didn't used to have this kind of understanding, but there's areas of education work where workers do hold quite a lot of power, but primarily in their role as childcare, rather than actual educators. Obviously, in educators, in some sense, the product is education, but where the capacity for education workers in general to cause the most disruption is in not caring for other workers' kids, so that then other workers have to stay home and look after their kids.
Which actually I think kind of during COVID really brought that home. Like once the schools closed, and then it was like, well, how the hell are people going to work all day? Whether they're like people who are going into work, because they're key workers or whatever, or whether they're working from home, if their kids are home, that's it. Production is grinding to a halt, And so, yeah, that's true. I think certainly, interestingly, I think that certainly in the UK, there's an argument for saying that the workplace power that workers have in education gets higher the younger the children that they work with are, but conversely, the strength of organisation, the associational power actually diminishes, so like primary school workers, so that would be like, ages 4 to 11, they probably have the most power, because if they go on strike and the kids have to stay home, all those parents have to take the day off work. You can't leave, even even a lot of 11-year-olds, you can't just leave them in the house on their own all day. Next up would be secondary school, and which is 11 to 18. And those kids kind of, especially in the older end of it, they're probably more likely to be able to be left alone at home. But then already you see that like secondary school teachers in the UK are much better organised than primary school teachers, almost always. And
although I would say that the inverse is generally the case when it comes to the support workers.
The teaching assistants are more powerful in primary school than in secondary school.
And better organised generally, yeah. Generally, because, in the UK, I mean, now it's different because the teachers' union does take school support staff, but before that, it was school support staff were in unison for the most part, or GMB, and teachers were in one of the teaching unions. And historically, the organisation of unison, at least in primary, was better than secondary.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting to think, like, she does mention a bunch of other industries that have the potential to have quite a lot of power. So, like, she talks about, like janitors and cleaners and things like that. And I suppose to a certain extent there have been quite a few struggles in that industry, and she mentions like justice for janitors in LA. And I think you could also think about some of the more recent stuff in the UK by smaller unions like UVW, United Voices of the World, and the IWGB, which is the Industrial Workers of Great Britain. She mentions that as a possible industry. I mean, she's very careful not to say that these will be the new industries that struggle will happen in.
I think that she's more pointing out that the service sector is the biggest part of the economy today, and then looking at examples of where organising has happened in the service sector.
Yeah, but she is sort of, proffering them as like a potential alternative to the auto industry, in terms of like, okay, this will be like the centre of gravity for a new kind of working class movement. And she's not saying they will, but she said, like, potentially this is one possibility for X, Y, and Z reason, because, yeah, like you say, services are really important, and there's been these struggles there. Education, the education industry is very important, and there's been these struggles there.
And transport
Transport is another one, yeah. And there's some excellent graphs as well about, again, it is a little bit like a kind of the technological fix. They basically had these excellent like graphs and tables about how transport strikes move from one form of transport to another. So starting off with like trains and then moving on to things like aviation and stuff like that, which is again is really really interesting. There's one that she mentions which is the semiconductor industry, like making like sort of small microchips and things like that. And I guess you mentioned that because like how central it is to so many products and around the world. And I think as far as I can tell, that one has not particularly come to fruition in any way.
Well, I think she does address that because already at that point it was very central, but it's a highly automated industry that doesn't need many workers, and also because it doesn't need many workers, you can pay the ones that there are quite well. So to kind of stop it being a terrain of that much struggle.
Yeah, and I guess like one thing, I mean, I don't know if there is a second edition that's coming out for this particular book, but like if there was, I think one sector that sort of feels lacking, or that I feel like could easily have gone in there is stuff like like warehouses and couriers and things like that for which I suppose is not a new industry, but the kind of the logistics sector more broadly, which has had huge struggles everywhere. And I think increasingly it's becoming kind of a more prominent feature of capitalism, everywhere basically. And I think what's really interesting about the logistics sector is that it's recreating the working class that capital had tried to sort of eliminate via the spatial fix, moving those big concentrations of workers around big urban centres, which was such a pain in the arse for the whole 20th century. And they worked so hard to get rid of them, and now it's recreated them in these like Amazon warehouses or these like whatever DPD or Hermes or whatever. And I think that is a potential new base of working class organising. I think I guess I don't know. I'm hesitant to call it a new industry because obviously warehouses and distribution existed before, but I feel like it exists now in this logistics sector in a kind of a new way. And so, I think that also has the potential to be a new sort of centre of gravity for workers' movement.
As we come marching in the beauty of the day.
That brings us to the end of this episode preview. To listen to the full thing and help support our work researching and promoting people's history, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes.